There's a growing unease in Britain's economic circles, and it's not just political theatre. A leading economist has issued a stark warning that the UK could be drifting towards stagflation, the uncomfortable mix of stubborn inflation, weak growth, and mounting pressure on public finances. At the same time, reports suggest £8.3 billion in spending cuts are being lined up, and that inevitably raises one pressing question for those in later life: what could this mean for your state pension and retirement income? When governments face tighter budgets, departments like the Department for Work and Pensions come under intense scrutiny. While the state pension is protected in law and currently linked to the triple lock, economic strain can influence how sustainable that promise feels in practice. Inflation affects the real value of your payments. Slow growth impacts tax revenues. And spending cuts often lead to policy reviews, delays, or reforms that can quietly reshape entitlements over time. This isn't about panic, it's about preparation. If stagflation does take hold, it could affect everything from annual uprating decisions to wider pension support and benefits. In this video, we'll break down what stagflation really means in plain English, how £8.3 billion in cuts could ripple through government spending, and most importantly, what it might mean for your pension security in the months and years ahead. So let's take this step by step, calmly and clearly, because when dramatic headlines start flying around about stagflation and billions in cuts, it's very easy to feel unsettled. The first thing to understand is what stagflation actually means in everyday life. It's not just an economic term used by analysts in London offices. It's something you feel at the supermarket till, on your energy bill, and when you notice that prices are still high but the wider economy isn't really growing. Inflation means the cost of living rises. Stagnation means the economy isn't expanding in a healthy way. When those two things happen together, governments face an incredibly difficult balancing act. They can't easily stimulate growth without risking more inflation, and they can't easily cut inflation without slowing the economy further. That tension is where pension concerns begin. Now, in the UK system, the state pension is overseen by the Department for Work and Pensions, often referred to simply as the DWP. Payments are funded from current taxation and national insurance contributions, not from a private pot set aside in your name. That means the health of the wider economy always matters. When the economy is strong and wages are rising, tax revenues increase. When growth slows and public borrowing rises, the government starts looking very carefully at every department's spending. That is where talk of £8.3 billion in cuts becomes relevant. Even if pensions themselves are politically sensitive, the financial pressure behind the scenes becomes very real. The current protection mechanism for the state pension is the triple lock. That promise means pensions rise each April by the highest of inflation, average earnings growth, or 2.5%. In recent years, because inflation surged, pension increases were significant. Many pensioners saw meaningful rises in their weekly payments. But here's the uncomfortable truth that isn't always spoken plainly. When inflation is high, the government's cost of uprating pensions also rises sharply. If inflation remains sticky while economic growth weakens, funding that promise becomes more expensive at precisely the time public finances are under strain. That doesn't automatically mean the triple lock disappears, but it does mean debates intensify behind closed doors. You may remember that the triple lock has already faced temporary adjustments in the past. During extraordinary circumstances, earnings data was modified because of distortions following the pandemic. That decision sparked criticism and political debate. It showed that even policies described as firm commitments can be reviewed when economic pressure builds. In a stagflation environment, the question policymakers quietly ask is not whether pensioners matter, but whether the formula remains affordable year after year if growth stays sluggish. Another layer to consider is how inflation behaves differently across households. Official figures measure average price rises, but many pensioners spend a larger proportion of their income on essentials such as food, heating, and housing. When energy costs surge, retirees often feel the impact more sharply because those costs represent a bigger slice of monthly expenditure. If inflation remains elevated in these categories while overall wage growth slows, the economic squeeze becomes uneven. That's one of the reasons any talk of fiscal tightening causes concern among older households. The £8.3 billion in proposed cuts doesn't automatically mean £8.3 billion is removed from pensions. Government spending is spread across multiple departments, from infrastructure and defence to welfare and local services. However, when budgets tighten, ripple effects occur. Administrative backlogs can increase. Reviews of eligibility criteria may accelerate. Certain support schemes might be frozen or reshaped. It's rarely a single dramatic announcement that changes everything overnight. More often, it's a series of technical adjustments that gradually shift the landscape. Let's also talk about borrowing, because this is central to the entire conversation. When growth slows and tax revenues weaken, governments borrow more to maintain spending. Borrowing itself isn't unusual, but it becomes more expensive when interest rates are high. Higher interest payments mean a larger share of government income goes towards servicing debt rather than funding services. In a stagflation scenario, inflation pressures may keep interest rates elevated for longer. That increases debt servicing costs. And when debt costs rise, savings must be found elsewhere unless taxes are increased. This is the broader financial backdrop against which pension policy decisions are made. It's important to separate fear from fact. The state pension is a statutory entitlement. It is not something that can be quietly cancelled. Any major reform would require parliamentary process, public debate, and political accountability. That gives pensioners a degree of structural protection. However, smaller adjustments are always possible. Changes to qualifying age, future accrual rates, or means-tested elements surrounding pension credit have all been topics of policy discussion over the years. Economic stress tends to bring those discussions forward. There is also the generational dimension. Policymakers often frame pension debates in terms of intergenerational fairness. Younger taxpayers fund today's pension payments. If economic growth stalls while the retired population grows, the financial ratio shifts. That doesn't mean pensioners are to blame. It simply reflects demographic reality. The UK has an aging population. Life expectancy has improved over decades, even if recent years have seen fluctuations. More retirees relative to working-age contributors increases pressure on pay-as-you-go systems. Now consider inflation from another angle. While high inflation raises pension payments under the triple lock, it also erodes purchasing power before uprating occurs. If prices climb sharply in 1 year, you feel the pain immediately. The increase in April is based on past data, not future forecasts. So there can be a lag between rising costs and compensation through higher payments. In a stagflation environment, that lag feels particularly uncomfortable because incomes outside the pension system may not be rising strongly either. We also need to think about private pensions and savings. Many retirees supplement their state pension with workplace or personal pensions. Investment returns can suffer when economic growth weakens. Markets react to inflation, interest rate decisions, and fiscal policy signals. If growth stagnates while inflation remains unpredictable, volatility often increases. That doesn't automatically mean losses, but it does create uncertainty. For someone drawing income from invested funds, market swings can feel just as significant as government policy shifts. The political context cannot be ignored. Any government facing warnings of stagflation must balance economic credibility with electoral reality. Pensioners vote in high numbers. That demographic reality shapes policy calculation. Promises around the state pension are rarely altered lightly because political consequences can be substantial. That provides a layer of reassurance, but it doesn't remove fiscal pressure entirely. Governments may look for savings in less visible areas first, such as administrative efficiencies or adjustments to ancillary benefits. Let's talk about pension credit, because it often enters the conversation when public finances tighten. Pension credit is designed to top up incomes for those on lower means. If economic conditions deteriorate, demand for such support can rise. At the same time, budget constraints may lead to stricter verification processes or outreach reforms. Again, these are technical adjustments, but they can affect real households. Ensuring eligibility checks are accurate and claims are properly made becomes increasingly important during financially constrained periods. Energy support is another example. In recent years, targeted assistance helped households manage rising bills. Such schemes are typically temporary and linked to specific economic shocks. In a stagflation scenario, policymakers must decide whether to extend targeted relief or rely on broader fiscal discipline. That balancing act affects pensioner households directly, especially those on fixed incomes. One of the most important practical steps for retirees is staying informed about official announcements rather than relying on speculation. Economic headlines often use dramatic language. Words like panic and crisis generate attention. But policy changes move through formal channels. Statements are made in Parliament. Budgets are presented publicly. Consultations are opened before reforms are enacted. Watching those formal processes gives a clearer picture than reacting to commentary alone. There's also a psychological side to this discussion. Uncertainty can be as stressful as actual financial loss. When you hear about billions in cuts and warnings of stagnation, it's natural to imagine worst-case scenarios. Yet historically, the UK has navigated periods of economic strain without dismantling the state pension system. Reforms have occurred, yes. The pension age has risen gradually. Certain earnings-related components were reshaped in the past. But the core principle of providing a baseline income in retirement has remained. What makes stagflation uniquely challenging is that it restricts policy tools. In a simple downturn with low inflation, governments can stimulate growth through spending or central banks can lower interest rates. In high inflation with strong growth, rates can be raised to cool demand. But when growth is weak and inflation persists, each option carries trade-offs. That complexity explains why economists sound cautious. It is not a declaration of collapse, but a warning that policy space is narrower. For pensioners, the key practical considerations are inflation exposure, benefit eligibility, and tax thresholds. If inflation stays high, reviewing household budgets becomes essential. Understanding which expenses are fixed and which can be adjusted helps maintain stability. Checking entitlement to pension credit or council tax reductions can also provide additional security. During tight fiscal periods, unclaimed benefits sometimes remain substantial simply because people assume they do not qualify. Another factor to keep in mind is taxation. The personal allowance threshold has been frozen in recent years. When pension payments rise under the triple lock, some retirees find themselves crossing tax thresholds unexpectedly. This phenomenon, sometimes called fiscal drag, can increase tax liability even if real purchasing power hasn't grown dramatically. In a stagflation environment, frozen thresholds combined with nominal income increases can subtly shift net income outcomes. It's also worth remembering that economic forecasts are not certainties. Economists issue warnings based on current data trends. Sometimes those trends change. Energy prices can stabilize. Supply chains can improve. Wage growth can adjust. The trajectory of inflation over the next few years will play a decisive role in shaping fiscal decisions. Governments respond not only to current figures but to projected paths. When we talk about £8.3 billion in cuts, scale matters. In the context of total UK public spending, which runs into hundreds of billions annually, £8.3 billion is significant but not system-shattering. The distribution of those cuts determines impact. If concentrated in capital projects, the short-term effect on pensioners may be limited. If spread across welfare budgets, scrutiny intensifies. That is why detail matters far more than headline numbers. The central message here is not alarm but awareness. Economic strain influences policy conversation. It does not automatically dismantle entitlements. The state pension remains embedded in UK law and political expectation. However, vigilance is wise. Watching budget statements, operating announcements, and official communications ensures you respond to real changes rather than rumors. As we move forward, the most constructive approach is steady monitoring rather than reactive fear. If stagflation risks persist, debates around sustainability will grow louder. If growth improves and inflation eases, fiscal pressure may soften. In either case, understanding the mechanisms behind pension funding gives you confidence. Knowledge replaces uncertainty with clarity. Ultimately, retirement security in Britain rests on a combination of statutory entitlement, political accountability, and economic capacity. Stagflation challenges capacity, but it does not erase the framework. £8.3 billion in cuts signals fiscal caution, not automatic pension reduction. The conversation unfolding now is about sustainability, prioritization, and balance. By staying informed, reviewing your entitlements, and understanding how inflation interacts with policy, you place yourself in a position of preparedness rather than anxiety. And in times of economic uncertainty, that calm, informed stance is perhaps the most valuable asset of all.